I'm going to ask Tlou to come up, and I guess also worth mentioning that, Tlou is a long friend of NBI, but also sits on the board of the Green Climate Fund. So has some deep insight into how some of these adaptation decisions are made. Thanks, Tlou.
No, thanks, Steve, and good morning, colleagues. Good morning, colleagues. How do I get to the presentation? And thank you very much for inviting us to this space to share with you the things that we are doing from the policy side of things. But I think having listened quite very closely to the brief, it is important that we indeed build partnership if we are to adapt to the challenges associated with climate change. I will start, Steve, by just colleagues providing a bit of what science is saying, and I know you might have delved deeper into this in the previous session, and then I'll therefore come in terms of what are we doing from the policy side of things, clarify a little bit in terms of the definition of adaptation from the international space. So I'll just try to jungle those and be as succinct as I could ever be. I think the first thing that we are observing, which science is telling us, is on the map you can see the darker spots, which now started to tell you that from the African perspective, Africa is warming much faster than any other continent in the world, whereas the average for the world is around 1 degree Celsius, and for Africa it's around 2 degrees and even more. And that on its own starts to tell you about the frequency of the extreme event that we are likely to have. When you look at these darker spots here, and when you look at the graph itself, it starts showing that all the darker spots, it shows in terms of how increasing warm is becoming of recent time. And bringing it back home, just trying to interpret it in a more simple way, we look in terms of what are the observed trends and what are the projections telling us. In terms of observed trends, I think there is a clear indication of the significant increases of temperature in all the seasons. You see it's getting warmer. High annual temperatures are, becoming more frequent. And under the projection as well, we look at both two elements, the low mitigation. And under low mitigation, it starts to show you that the temperature will increase greater than 4 degrees Celsius. You can imagine what 4 degrees will mean. It will mean extreme wet, extreme heat, extreme flooding, extreme storms and fires. And under the low mitigation scenarios, you are seeing an increase of around 6 degrees Celsius. And that its own, it tells us that we are going to have all these frequencies that we have to deal with. On the precipitation side of things, we've started seeing the above, we have observed the above average rainfall between 1970 and from late 1980 and around late 1990. But right now we are starting to see, we have observed largely around the below average rainfalls. And these explain some of the issues that we've been grappling with, drought in Cape Town, drought in some of the other part of the region in the country, Northwest, who's still trying to get out of the grip of a drought, the Free State still trying to get out of the grip of the drought. But science in terms of the precipitation, this is the rainfall prediction, is a bit uncertain in terms of what we are likely to experience. Well, with in mind that we'll be talking to the private sector, I think the World Economic Forum has already identified climate change as one of the key risks that will affect, of course, economic growth, that will affect our ability to address some of the triple challenges that we are having, inequality from the South African perspective, poverty and unemployment. And if the World Economic Forum, where this business meet, has identified this as a risk, already it shows that from the country perspective, we might want to strike those partnerships private sector, government, and civil society, and see what is it that we can do to start addressing the challenges that are associated with this climate change. We participate in the international space. We engaged within the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, and that's where the international community comes together to try and address the effect of climate change. And we have adopted what we call the Paris Agreement. There was a Kyoto Protocol. Now we have adopted the Paris Agreement that try to bring nations together to collaborate in terms of addressing the challenges that are associated with climate change. And in the Paris Agreement, there are three main key goals that we are trying to work towards achieving as the global community. The first one is what we call a temperature goal. On the temperature goal, the agreement is to try and hold the increase of temperature on average just below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level. So that is the goal that we have set for ourselves as the international community. On the adaptation side of things, we have established what we call the global goal on adaptation, with the main focus being enhancing our adaptive capacity. How can we adapt to these changes, strengthening our resilience and reducing our vulnerability? And I think the establishment of the goal itself, we're trying to push the narrative that adaptation is a global responsibility. If we are to adapt, we need to act together, both from developing and developed nations. And in the main, developing countries are the ones that are highly affected by the impact of climate change due to the vulnerability, due to our ability to can adapt to these extreme events. The third focus is around long-term financing. And I think you spoke around the financing. The previous session touched largely on the financing. How do we mobilize these resources to can enable, in the main, developing countries to adapt, to can enable the global community to can reduce the emissions as per the global goal? So these are the three key areas within the Paris Agreement. And on the long-term financing, you are looking in terms of support for technology as well. What type of technology will be required? You are looking support for all other resources, human capacity that you would need to address climate change. And these are some of the contentious issues that we are grappling with if we are to really respond to the climate change. At current, I think there are studies that have been commissioned through the IPCC. This is the intergovernmental body that deals with climate change within the global space. And you could see that in terms of the forecast, already your 2 degree, we are moving from 1 degree Celsius at current. And when you start moving towards 2.7 degrees to 4.5 degrees, that's where you start to see the intensity of the impact of climate change. And on 4.4 degrees to 5 degrees, it looks in terms of the current business as usual. To say with the current interventions that we are having, we are unlikely to reach that global goal that we have set for ourselves. And this talks about the intensity of this extreme event that you'll start to experience. There was a study that has been conducted, which is called the Special Report by the IPCC on 1.5 degrees Celsius. What does it mean to reduce the emission by 1.5? And in that study, they did a comparison to say 1.5 versus 2 degrees increase. What are some of the implications that we are starting to see from that perspective? And you can see from this area that in terms of the flood increase, at 1.5, you are likely to get 100% increase in flood risks. Whereas at 2 degrees Celsius, you are likely to get around 170% increase in flood risks. And then you start to ask yourself from the South African perspective, South African context, how do we survive with such extreme event? On the species side, this just start to tell you the percentage of plants and insects that will be affected, from 6% insects to 18% by 2 degrees Celsius. And when you look in terms of the people side, the percentage of the world's population that will also be affected. You can see the comparison. To say at 1.5, it's worse. At 2 degrees, it's going to be even more worse. And that talks to the fact that we now need to act as a global community to address adaptation. Sea level rise, 46 million people will be impacted at 1.5. And at 2 degrees, you are looking at around 49%, 49 million people that will be impacted there. So just to show you some of this extreme, effect of the global warming. Then, these are some of the things that I thought, let me just put a lot of pictures for all of us to reflect on. Some of the things that we are likely to experience, some of the things that are becoming more frequent, getting more flooding. And when you look on the other side, the informal settlement, imagine what would happen around the informal settlement with those increases. Look around the hospitals, the effect on the health sector, and the impact thereof. Look around, the impact on our infrastructure, on our road infrastructure. We have spoken around drought. We have been struggling from coming out from the drought effect in recent time from South Africa. So these are some of the impact that we are likely to have. Mpumalanga, in recent time, there was some bridge that has been destroyed, destruction of infrastructure, destruction of road. What are some of the implications as far as doing business as well, if I may put it from that context? Look at the railway line there being affected by, this sea level rise. Look at the type of hail, stones coming down, destroying your infrastructure, destroying your cars and so forth. I thought, let me put these pictures just to have a look in terms of what are some of the impacts that we are currently experiencing, that we have experienced, and what more if we are not able to cap the emissions. Then it comes to the questions, how do we adapt and what is this adaptation? Some spoke about additionality, what is it that we can do and how is adaptation defined in the global space in terms of our engagement within the UNFCCC. I thought, let me just rather put a very simple definition on what adaptation means. Because oftentimes we confuse adaptation and mitigation. On the mitigation side, we are talking about the reduction of emission. But on the adaptation side, we are looking in terms of what adjustment, socio-economic adjustment, ecological adjustment that we can make to can cope with this expected impact. So we need to make some adjustment. What are some of the processes that we can put in place to moderate the damages, but to also try and harness the benefits that are associated with this climate change impact? I think from adaptation side, we are saying, you are going to experience this impact. How do we get ready? How do we adjust our systems to can be able to reduce the impact of climate change? And I think one of the key things in terms of the importance of adaptation is around reducing the impact, reducing vulnerability, and of course, trying to reduce the exposure to the impact, increasing our ability to be resilient to the impact of climate change. Well, we can look at the various themes that, of course, would really can build some interventions around in terms of us adapting to the impact of climate change. We can look at the water resource management, and I think there are a lot of things that colleagues might share probably during the panel discussion in terms of what they are doing. rainwater harvesting systems as being one of the key elements, land management, climate smart agriculture from the health point of view, what are some of the things that we can do, infrastructure development, how do we do infrastructure proving to avoid the effect of climate change, how do you deal with the whole fragile ecosystem built through ecosystem-based adaptation, can build some of the artificial wetlands, you can rehabilitate the wetlands to be able to, absorb more water. You can look in terms of integrated coastal management. How do you make sure that people are not now going to build on the floodplain? And these are some of the elements that I thought, let me just highlight, which we can really think around when we build our adaptive measures. The early warning systems, working with South African Weather Service and most other institutions that are able to produce the projections, are able to produce the early warning systems, working with National Disaster Management, integrating climate change in the disaster risk response and disaster risk reductions. So these are some of the key thematic focus that I thought I can bring into our conversation to say we can build interventions that revolve around it, but they are not all limited to these key examples. So from the government point of view, there are a number of things that we are doing, which I thought let me share with you. We are, of course, developed what we call the nationally determined commitment. This is our commitment to what's implementing the Paris Agreement. And in the nationally determined contribution, we have identified a number of goals from the adaptation side of things, which as a country we need to do. One was the development of the adaptation plan / adaptation strategy, which we have it's currently en route to cabinet for approval to try and mobilize the society at large towards implementation and responding to the impact of climate change. The other key area is around the mainstreaming aspect. How do we now make sure that climate considerations are taken into account in the national development planning processes, in the sectoral policy processes? And this is one of the key areas that we have worked with the sectors. We have worked with the water sector, agricultural sector, we have worked with the health sector, we have worked with human settlement, to try and make sure that they bring in the element of climate change in their planning processes, building the necessary institutional capacity, where we have structures such as the National Climate Change Committee. We have structured at the local level. They have different forums where stakeholders will be able to interact and work collaboratively to respond to climate change, develop an early warning systems. We're working with the South African Weather Services, we are working with the ARC, we are working with the CSIRs to ensure that we enhance our early warning system, development of climate informations and products that can be easily accessible to the society at large, development of the vulnerability assessment framework. We're currently working on the framework that will guide all sectors to can be able to undertake climate change and risk and vulnerability assessment. In the main, it will help us as a country to can be able to aggregate information, because at current, everyone is doing risk and vulnerability using different approaches and different methodologies. So we are working on that framework to provide a clear guidance. And from the monitoring and evaluation systems, we need to work in terms of us understanding some of the investment from the adaptation point of view to say how much are we contributing towards adaptation. And you find from the African perspective where we shifting money from development, money from our GDP towards addressing some of these challenges. So we now need to do a proper account in terms of how much is it being channeled to adaptation. In terms of the policy landscape, we of course we did what we call the scenario work. And this is just to look in terms of what are the projections telling us, what are some of the adaptation interventions that would guide the different sectors in the country. And we therefore look at, in terms of the impact analysis around these key sectors here: water, agriculture, forestry, human settlement, marine and fisheries, to say within those sectors, what are we observing, and what are some of the interventions that can be undertaken. And from there, we then did what we call the planning processes. On the planning here, we're working with the sectors. Most sectors have now developed their adaptation plans. We're working with the provincial and the local sphere. In the provincial, we've helped them in terms of the development of the provincial adaptation strategies. Or the local level, particularly at the district level, we have worked with them to develop the response plan, the adaptation strategies at the district municipalities. And of course, we developed what we call the framework for climate services. And this is a framework that starts to bring all role players together. Hence, I've said we are working with the South African Weather Service to can ensure that we are able to enhance our early warning systems. And we have implementation of some of the projects here. And these projects are spread across. There are projects that are being implemented under the SANBI, which are funded largely by the Adaptation Fund. There is work that we are doing within the department through the donor funding, where we have a facility that will start facilitating implementation of projects to test some of these approaches that we're talking about. And this facility is called Adaptive Capacity Facility. Within the department will run for a period of 5 years from now on to test some of these projects, with the hope that some of the output from the testing and piloting can be scaled to bigger projects and be able to attract funding from the GCF and other multilateral financing. So on this slide, just share with you in terms of the broader areas of adaptation. I've already spoken to our international work, which we are, of course, engaged in the negotiations, engaged in the also international mechanism negotiations on loss and damage, where we're trying to also understand, one, what are some of the loss and damage that are associated with adaptation, and who should be responsible to support those who are highly affected, particularly from the global space. And we doing the climate services. We have different pilot projects that we are implementing here. Some include awareness raising at a grassroots. We're working with also the National School of Government in terms of mainstreaming climate change into the curriculum of all the induction processes, to ensure that at a senior level, government will be able to have a clear understanding across different sectors in terms of the impact of climate change, working on the awareness raising with different provinces, develop the awareness raising materials, and ensure that they are disseminated to communities. And we, of course, have developed the National Adaptation Strategy, which I'll get into, work with the provinces in terms of developing their necessary response strategies, and working with the local district and local municipality to integrate climate change into their planning system, into the IDPs, and so forth. On the adaptation strategy, which is en route to government, it was a consultative process. It took long, owing to the complexity of adaptation. And we currently working towards getting the strategy approved in cabinet. But just in terms of summary, we have the strategic areas that are focusing on these 12 outcomes. One is to increase resilience and adaptive capacity. That is one of the key outcomes that we'll be focusing on in the strategy, galvanizing all sectors of society to make sure that their contribute proportionally towards that outcome. The other area is around enhancing climate services, ensuring that we have climate products, information products that can be developed, easy of access by all users. And we're working in terms of building that risk and vulnerability framework to provide guidance in terms of across the various sectors, how would they undertake risk and vulnerability assessment. We're still pushing hard for adaptation planning across the sectors that have been identified to ensure that all sectors that have been identified, largely in the policy, the health sector, the agricultural sector, human settlement sector, the biodiversity sector, are able to mainstream climate change and build adaptation planning within their systems. And we also want to make sure that we increase research output, working with different universities. Others will be doing projections. And one of the key things that was coming was around the cost for adaptation. If we are to really adequately respond, what will be the cost that will be required for a country to can adapt, and what will be the cost for maladaptation or the cost for non-action. So those are some of the elements that we are building in terms of the research agenda. Building massive awareness, ensuring that the community at large is conscious of this climate change, conscious of the impact that are associated with climate change, building adaptation governance that will be defined within the Climate Change Act. We're currently working on the Climate Change Bill, where the discussion are at NETLEC to try and build a proper governance to enable coordination of government across all the levels to can respond to climate change. And I think the other area that I want to emphasize is around building this partnership. And I think this platform is crucial to see what is it that we want to see in this partnership, how can we build this partnership to can be able to respond, and the building of the monitoring and evaluation system. We are building a national system where all these interventions will be deposited into and will be able to do the assessment of impact, and this system should be able to assess the impact, should be a source of information in terms of our international reporting. These are some of the case studies that we're doing, and largely this is your biogas case study that we're doing, with rainwater harvesting tanks that you started to see, your ecosystem-based and infrastructure proving, livelihood security in some of the communities funded largely through the Adaptation Fund. But I think finally, it's in building that partnership, there's a whole key area around information. Information will be very crucial for us to be able to plan for adaptation. And the other key area is in this information, building our monitoring and evaluation system will be working. We are working with all these key stakeholders, working with ARC, working with the WRC, SANBI, SOurce, universities, CSIR, and SANEDI to make sure that the data and the required information will be available and will be disseminated to the society at large for planning processes. And this will help us, as I've already alluded to, in terms of tracking progress and in terms of particularly for adaptation, and do the impact assessment and be able to respond to the international community in terms of reporting. In a nutshell, that's what I thought I could share with you colleagues, and I would appreciate inputs, comments, and questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Any questions?
And I was looking at your last slide where you have mining, industry, transport, energy. Because what if we get stuck in one sector? Like we don't change our transport systems and the ramifications, you can't really adapt everything else. I'm just wondering about that impact. I mean, how can one drive to make sure that mining, industry, transport, and specifically energy all adapt and actually move forward and together without anything actually getting badly out of kilter?
There's another question here. Should we take, what's the other one? Chairman?
Thank you for the presentation. You started with the slide on the international commitments and with the goals. And I just wanted your perspective on if we're not meeting the temperature goal, how does the dynamics of the other two shift and the implications of that in the broader context? Because I think the general view is that it's unlikely that we're going to meet that. But I think that's in the public kind of discourse, that's what we're hearing. I don't know if it's true. And so, just your view on that would be helpful. Thanks.
I think the one on the sectors. Well, what we are trying to do is to really galvanize action across the various sectors. If you look at the mining sector, there are certain things that are very specific to the mining sector that they can do to adapt. They can either look at the demand side from water point of view, largely because water is one of the strategic input into the mining. And again, we are the 30th most dry water scarce country. So those are some of the elements that we could do. So there is interconnection across the sectors from adaptation, because when I look at water as a strategic input, either from the mining and even from agriculture becomes one of the strategic input. So it will be important in our view as we build this guidance in terms of what has been projected to see how each and every sector will be able to pick and facilitate adaptation. At current, there are no penalties that will be imposed, unfortunately. But we currently working from what we call an Intergovernmental Framework Act to ensure that from the intergovernmental side of things, we are able to push for, in our regulatory work, we able to mainstream climate change as one of the key elements for consideration. And in doing that, we'll be able to reach out to all the sectors. And I think the finalization of the climate change bill will be a key instrument as well to help us in ensuring that at an intergovernmental level, there's clear preparations and there's a clear coordination, and that will also filter down in terms of their regulatory and policy framework on how do they mainstream climate change into their planning system to, facilitate, to coordinate, to further regulate, adaptation across the various spheres and the various operations. It's rather a complex one, I must say, but I guess it's a challenge that we need to pick up and pursue in line with what the projections are telling us. The implications, they are so interrelated. I mean, for us to reach 2 degrees Celsius, you will need resources. You will need financing to finance this transition. And if you don't have adequate resources, definitely from the African point of view, you are unlikely to reach that. The synthesis report of all the various NDC point to the fact that the world is unlikely to reach the goal. What then it implies from the adaptation point of view is we'll experience this extreme event, we would need resources can be able to adapt. More and more resources, because the likelihood at current is clear that we are not going to be able to reach the temperature goal. And countries have been requested to update their NDC, which should be due this year. And I think after the update, they will do a synthesis. And that synthesis will be able to tell whether countries or globally we are able to reach the goal. So what I can say is reaching the 2 degrees, holding the temperature below the 2 degrees has direct implication to our adaptation, because our ability to adapt also depend with the level of emission reduction. The more you reduce, the lesser resource will be required for adaptation. The lesser you reduce, the more resources will be required. The lesser you reduce, the more vulnerable, in particular for developing countries, they become. So there's this, interrelated relations. And at the heart of it is going to be the resourcing. Hence the establishment of the Green Climate Fund, in the main to support developing countries to address climate change, with the objective of raising that 100 billion annual. So we would need a lot of resources to address this climate change. So I would say they are interrelated. You can't do one and not do the other. When you fail to achieve that, it affects the entire system, and it affects the various goals in terms of our ability to achieve those goals.
It's Sakilai Nedbank. You highlighted the interdependency between mitigation and adaptation. We've got Eskom, decarbonisation and renewables, very prominent, a bankable solution in the market, yet we do not see government playing. How serious are we about this 2 degrees? Because we can decarbonise, accelerate decarbonisation by rolling out renewables, and that could save us a lot of the consequences of and the cost associated with adaptation. Why do you think we have this stalemate? We sit with that solution, we're stalling it for 2-3 years. We could save a lot of water and limit emissions, and yet we don't see government playing, government stalling. The private sector is ready to roll out.
Thank you very much, Tlou. My question was just tapping into your insight and participation on a global scale. Perhaps you can just reflect the level of participation of the private sector that you're seeing in the Green Climate Fund portfolio of projects, and perhaps also to just give us some insight of what you think can be done even at that level to increase the participation. And lastly, perhaps to just highlight from your perspective the advantages that the South African business sector really has in being able to come up with projects that are of scale and sufficient complexity to attract additional funds.
Can I start with the difficult one first? I think I come from environmental affairs, where we largely looking at the climate change policy, and in there what we do is we try to work with different sectors in government through the Intergovernmental Framework Act to, one, facilitate the mainstreaming of climate change, and to advocate as well for the consideration of climate change in the policy planning processes. With that said, I'm not going to pick specifically on any particular project or entity, and I think Eskom or the Department of Energy will be more versed to respond, because I don't know some of the dynamics or the technical details that you are pointing to. But with that said, I think as our contribution into the IRP, you could see that in terms of the energy mix, as DEFF, we've been pushing for an increase in terms of the renewable, and I think the communication to that effect has been made with the current IRP, where you start to see the increase of renewable as part of the government policy around energy. But I think the Department of Energy and possibly Eskom will be the best to can respond to some of the nitty-gritties and the details of your question, if I may. The private sector involvement. Well, in the current portfolio of projects, the reality is you see lesser private sector participating, and I think that might probably be due to the accreditation processes, because at current you have largely the multilateral organization being accredited, and we have what you call the direct entities, where you have mainly government entities that are accredited into the process. And I think I've been engaging with some of our colleagues from DBSA who are accredited. I've been engaging with SANBI, who stand ready to engage more with the private sector and try to build those partnerships and see, as South Africa, what project of scales we can really try to push within the GCF and try to get more funding in that space. One of the key issue that is currently on the table for engagement in terms of accreditation is to how do you facilitate private sector accreditation into the process from a project-based point of view, and it's one of the lengthy conversation that I think still happening, within the processes of the GCF. And I think, in my view, once those issues are clarified, it might catalyze enhanced participation of private sector into the process. But with that said, I would encourage us to, from the country perspective, to see how do we forge this partnership with our accredited entities. What type of projects can we build? At what scale? What type of partnership can we build? I've engaged with SANBI. They said they stand ready to work with any organization that's interested, and they are even willing to do focus engagement and see how best can we package those projects at scale and build those partnerships and work with these entities to ensure that we have our projects approved. Because the current modality is within the GCF, you work through the accredited entities. You can't go direct. So it will be beneficial. Maybe this platform is also crucial in that sense that it can foster that collaboration with accredited entities and see how can we build projects that are at scale.
Well, thanks, Tlou. Appreciate your input. And I think there are a couple of really important things that come out of that. First of all, the willingness for us to work together. And I think that's key. Business has specifically mentioned the National Adaptation Strategy, particularly in areas of finance and project development. And so there's a big role for us to play. And the channels and the willingness are there for us to work with governments. That's really exciting. Thank you so much.